All right, today we're jumping into the story of India's independence, but I want you to forget everything you might think you know about a single straightforward fight. This wasn't that. This was a masterclass in evolution, a nearly century-long chess game where the strategies for resistance were constantly shifting, constantly adapting.
So how does a nation win its freedom, especially against the most powerful empire on the planet? Well, as we're about to see, for India, there was no single answer. It was more like a constantly evolving playbook, moving from armed revolts to constitutional debate to boycotts and eventually to mass civil disobedience. So let's dive in. We've got to start at the beginning with that first massive explosion of resistance.
Okay, so our story kicks off with the very first huge nationwide challenge to British rule. And it didn't start out as some grand planned revolution. Nope. It was more like a single spark in a giant powder keg, a spark that would just ignite a firestorm and really set the stage for everything that came after. We've all heard the revolt of 1857 called the Sepoy Mutiny, right? But that name, it totally misses the point. The real story is that this was a massive civil rebellion. The soldiers' mutiny, that was just the match that lit the fuse. It unleashed this incredible flood of anger that had been simmering for decades right across the country. And what's just incredible is who joins this fight. I mean, look at this. It wasn't just one group of people. You had princes who'd lost their kingdoms, like the legendary Rani Lakshmibai, fighting right alongside peasants, artisans, even religious leaders. What does that tell you? It shows this was a true cross-section of Indian society, all of them brought together by one single, powerful grievance against the British. So, after the 1857 rebellion was, well, brutally crushed, it became crystal clear that just using force wasn't going to work. The strategy had to change. It had to evolve. So the era of this kind of spontaneous armed revolt, that gave way to a whole new phase. A slow, deliberate, organized fight. One that wasn't waged on the battlefield, but in the halls of power. And what's fascinating is that even before 1857, early thinkers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy saw this crucial connection. He argued that social and religious reform, things like challenging the caste system, wasn't some separate issue. His thinking was incredibly strategic. He believed that to be strong enough to actually challenge the British Empire, Indian society first had to deal with its own internal divisions. So, when the Indian National Congress finally formed in 1885, people saw it in two totally different ways. The British, they hoped it would be a safety valve. A nice safe place for educated Indians to let off some steam without causing any real trouble. But the Indian founders, they had a much smarter plan. They saw it as a lightning conductor, a tool to unite the entire country, channel all that frustration into a real political force, and, at the same time, protect the movement from a direct government crackdown. Pretty brilliant, right? And believe me, this lightning conductor wasn't just for some quiet backroom meetings. Leaders like Pharaoh Shah Mehta, they used the new legislative councils as a political stage. They weren't just playing along, they were openly challenging the system. When Manta got up and just fearlessly ripped into the colonial bureaucracy, someone who was there said it was like a bomb had been thrown. This was a totally new, defiant spirit, holding power to account right in its own house. But you can imagine. All this petitioning and debating, it was a slow, frustrating process. And for a younger, more impatient generation, it just wasn't cutting it. So as the 20th century kicked off, all that frustration just boiled over into way more radical ideas. And they were all centered on one single, powerful concept: self-reliance. The Swadeshi movement was really a masterclass in this new way of thinking. I mean, it went way beyond just boycotting British goods. This was a constructive program, and it's all summed up in this one concept, Atmasakti, which basically means self-reliance. The whole goal wasn't just to tear down the British system, it was to build an alternative Indian one right alongside it, with its own schools, its own industries, and a powerful new sense of national pride. At the exact same time, there was another path emerging, a much more violent one. You had these small, secret societies of revolutionaries who completely rejected the slow, patient path. They believed freedom could only be won through force. Now, they never got a huge mass following, and they never really threatened British rule, but their defiant heroism had this massive psychological impact. They inspired so many people, and, as this quote says, they gave us back the pride of our manhood. But all of these different streams of resistance, the constitutional path, the self-reliance movement, the revolutionaries,
They were all about to be completely transformed by the arrival of one person. When Mohandas Gandhi came back to India, he changed the entire game. He took the struggle out of the meeting rooms of the elites and brought it to the fields and villages, to everyday people. Gandhi's core strategy, satyagraha, which means truth force, was all about careful step-by-step escalation. First, he tested his methods on a smaller local level, like with the Kia satyagraha. Once he proved it worked, he scaled it up to the first ever nationwide non-cooperation movement. And then came the masterstroke, the Dandi Salt March. It was just a simple, brilliant act of defiance, making salt from the sea. It was something the entire nation could understand, could rally behind, and could actually participate in. Just genius. And the response? It was absolutely staggering. In just the first few months of the civil disobedience movement that kicked off after the Salt March, over 80,000 people were thrown in jail. Just stop and think about that number for a second. 80,000. That's the sheer scale of mass participation that Gandhi had just unlocked. The freedom struggle was no longer some project for the elites. It was now, for real, a movement of the masses. And this idea of freedom, or Swaraj, it wasn't just some abstract political idea. The Karachi Resolution from 1931 really shows us what it meant in real, tangible terms for ordinary people. It was a promise of actual economic and social change. We're talking about the right to vote for everyone, free education, debt relief for farmers, a living wage for workers. This was the vision of a new, just society that people were actually fighting and going to jail for. Then World War II breaks out, and this just pushes the whole struggle into its final, most intense phase. Think about it. Britain is out there fighting for its own freedom in Europe, and the hypocrisy of its colonial rule is just laid bare for everyone to see. The time for petitions, for slow, gradual progress, that was over. The demand was now absolute and immediate. But it was going to come at a truly devastating cost. And it all boiled down to just 3 words: do or die. This was Gandhi's final ultimate call to the nation in 1942, launching the Quit India movement. It was a clear ultimatum: no more talks, no more negotiations, no turning back. It was a flat-out declaration that the struggle would now continue to the absolute end, no matter what the cost. And this brings us to the really profound and painful contradiction that's right at the heart of India's independence. You have these 2 realities happening at the exact same time. On one side, you have the triumphant end of a long, heroic struggle for freedom, and on the other, the unimaginable tragedy of partition, one of the biggest, most violent mass migrations in all of human history. Freedom had finally come, but it was born in so much sorrow. And yet, even in the middle of all that tragedy, leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru tried to look forward. He framed partition not as some final failure, but as a dark passage. A valley of the shadow that India just had to get through on its journey to becoming the united, strong nation he was so sure was its destiny. So independence was won in 1947, but the story, it really doesn't end there. The legacy of this long, constantly evolving struggle is baked into the DNA of the nation itself, which kind of leaves us with one last big question to think about. How did this incredible journey of different strategies, from debate to defiance, from armed rebellion all the way to nonviolent resistance, how did it not only win freedom, but also end up shaping the very essence of the world's largest democracy?